48 hours ago, the horizon turned into a secondary sun and shattered every window in your zip code. You spent the last 2 days shivering in the dark of your basement, listening to the insidious hiss of radioactive dust settling on your roof like a malignant snowstorm. This is Day 3. The honeymoon phase of the apocalypse is officially over. You might think the worst is behind you simply because the ground has stopped shaking and the emergency sirens have finally bled dry. That is a fatal error. The initial flash was just the entry fee. The blast wave was just the opening act. Now comes the actual work. You are breathing stale, recycled air, staring at a family that expects you to have all the answers. The silence in your mid-sized town is absolute, heavy, and terrifying. It is the sound of a grid-down environment where the standard rules of civilization have been suspended indefinitely. Every tick of the clock is a reminder that you are trapped in a critical decision window. You survived the flash, but survival is not a one-time event. It is a continuous, grueling process. The choices you make in the next 24 hours will dictate whether your family lives to see Day 4 or becomes another statistic buried under a layer of radioactive ash. The standard civilian reaction at the 72-hour mark is a dangerous blend of normalcy bias and profound impatience. I have seen it time and time again downrange. People treat a nuclear escalation like a severe hurricane. They think Day 3 means the storm has passed, and it is time to step outside and assess the roof damage. They assume the sky is not on fire anymore, so the threat must be entirely gone. You will see neighbours stepping out onto their porches in flip-flops and t-shirts, squinting at the sky, trying to check if their trucks will start. They wander around their front lawns, brushing the fallout ash off their windshields with their bare hands, like it is spring pollen. This is how the masses panic. They do not run around screaming in the streets. They default to their morning routines because their brains cannot process the magnitude of the invisible threat surrounding them. They treat it like a movie where the hero emerges from the rubble and walks into the sunset. They do not realise that every step they take in that dust is kicking up microscopic particles of death. They are essentially painting a target on their own backs because they absolutely refuse to accept that their old world is dead. Let us talk operational math and debunk the comforting lies you are telling yourself. You might think the military has a magical fleet of helicopters ready to swoop in and wash the radiation away. That is a tactical fantasy. The reality is driven by cold, hard physics. At 49 hours post-detonation, radiation in your heavy fallout zone has dropped to approximately 1% of its 1-hour value. That means you are looking at roughly 10 Roentgens per hour. FEMA guidance explicitly states that the 48 to 72-hour window is when short, purposeful exits become possible in cases of extreme necessity. A dose of 10 Roentgens per hour means accumulating 10 rem per hour of exposure. If you stay outside for 30 minutes, you absorb about 5 rem. For context, 5 rem is the annual occupational limit for radiation workers. It is not immediately lethal, but it is not a casual stroll either. You might think the National Guard is going to roll down Main Street any minute to handle this extraction for you. Here is the steelman reality of the situation. 10 Roentgens per hour is still far too hot for mass troop deployment or unarmoured convoy operations. The military is prioritising strategic assets, not your cul-de-sac. They are securing ports, command centres, and remaining power infrastructure. You are completely on your own, and waiting for a rescue chopper is a guaranteed way to starve to death in your living room. The invisible killer outside your door does not care about your optimism. The specific complication with a nuclear event is that the threat does not growl, it does not bleed, and you cannot shoot it with a rifle. It just silently rewrites your cellular structure while you are busy trying to figure out what to do next. This brings us to the most critical failure point of Day 3, inventory delusion. Most people think they have 2 weeks of food and water stored up. The math usually says they have 4 days tops. They panic when they realise the pantry is already half empty by Tuesday. Stop guessing and hoping. Go to protocolsurvival.com and get your real survival score. The calculator is free to try. It will tell you exactly how long you actually have before the starvation clock starts ticking. Do not wait until your kid is crying to realise you are entirely out of calories. You need to lock down your logistics right now. The fallout outside is degrading at a predictable rate, but your internal supplies are vanishing exponentially faster than you think. Every single calorie consumed in panic is a calorie stolen from your family's future. You are operating in a zero-margin environment now. Protocol Survival is your required command centre for this harsh reality. Calculate your actual burn rate before you make a fatal logistical error. The time for hiding in the dark is over. You are 48 hours deep into a grid-down scenario and your supplies are bleeding out. It is time for the first reconnaissance outside the wire. You stand in your mudroom, taping the edges of an N95 mask to your face with duct tape, feeling the cold sweat bead on your forehead. You are wearing long sleeves, a heavy winter coat, a beanie, and airtight safety goggles. You look like a hazmat nightmare, but this is the new standard operating procedure. Outside your front door, the town is buried under a layer of grey, powdery fallout. It looks like dirty snow, but it is highly radioactive ash that will burn your lungs from the inside out if you breathe it in. You grip the doorknob, feeling the cold metal through 2 layers of heavy nitrile gloves. You are not going out there to be an action hero. You are going out there because your family is relying on you to secure the perimeter and locate a sustainable water source. The silence outside is deafening. There are no birds chirping. There is no traffic humming. Just the wind blowing radioactive death across your asphalt driveway. You take a deep breath of filtered air, twist the deadbolt, and step out into the ruins of your old life. Every second you spend out here is ticking against your biological clock. When the front door opens, the average civilian completely loses their tactical bearing. They step into the fallout zone and treat it like an interactive museum exhibit. I have seen guys walk down the middle of the street, kicking up clouds of radioactive dust just to see what the neighbourhood looks like. They wander over to their buddy's house, knock on the door, and stand on the porch breathing heavily, entirely ignoring the fact that their improvised mask is slipping off their nose. They treat the excursion like a neighbourhood watch patrol, gawking at the collapsed utility poles and the cars that crashed during the EMP wave. This is a fatal behavioural failure. They are operating like tourists in a wasteland instead of operators in a hot zone. Every moment they spend standing around looking at the damage is adding REMs to their cumulative exposure. They do not walk with purpose. They do not stick to the shadows or the hardball roads. They trudge right through the deepest drifts of fallout ash because they think their rubber boots make them invincible. By the time they finally decide to turn around and head back home, their outer layer of clothing is completely saturated with alpha and beta emitters. They have turned themselves into a walking dirty bomb for their own family. Surviving the recon mission requires absolute adherence to the stopwatch. You have a maximum of 30 minutes. You might think that wrapping yourself in a heavy winter coat, gloves and a mask makes you perfectly immune to the environment. Here is the Steelman reality that will get you killed if you ignore it. Your makeshift hazmat suit only protects you from alpha and beta particles. It stops the radioactive dust from physically touching your skin or entering your respiratory system. It does absolutely nothing to stop the ambient gamma radiation saturating the neighbourhood. Gamma rays punch right through heavy winter coats like light through a window pane. That is why the 30-minute limit is a hard stop, not a suggestion. At 10 Röntgens per hour, a 30-minute sprint exposes you to 5 REM. That is manageable. If you get distracted and stay out for 2 hours looking for supplies, you absorb 20 REM. Now you are entering the zone of chromosomal damage and long-term health compromises. You must move with extreme violence of action. You assess the structural integrity of your roof. You check the nearest drainage ditch for water flow. You observe the sightlines of your street, and you get back inside. No lingering, no chatting with the neighbour shouting from his second-story window. You are on a ticking clock, and physics does not negotiate. The most dangerous part of the reconnaissance mission is not stepping outside. The specific complication that kills entire families is stepping back inside. Decontamination is vastly harder than the mission itself. You cannot just walk into your living room and peel off your jacket like it is a normal winter day. The moment you cross that threshold, you are bringing the enemy into the wire. Every speck of ash on your boots is a tiny, localized radiation source. You must establish a rigid decontamination zone in your mudroom or garage before you ever leave the house. The threat here is cross-contamination. If you touch your face while pulling off your nitrile gloves, you have just transferred radioactive isotopes directly to your skin. You have to carefully bag the outer layer of clothing, seal it in heavy-duty contractor trash bags, and leave it in the isolation zone. You do not do this meticulously just to follow a manual. You do it because the alternative is tracking microscopic poison onto the carpet where your child sleeps. You do it so your kid does not inhale strontium-90 while playing on the floor. One sloppy mistake in the mudroom undoes all the protection of the last 48 hours. Your house is a submarine. The airlock must remain uncompromised. If you fail the decontamination protocol, you are the one who nuked your own living room. By the 72-hour mark, the psychological strain begins to manifest as false hope. You sit in the dim light of your kitchen, violently cranking the handle on your emergency hand crank radio. Through the deafening static, you manage to catch fragments of an automated emergency broadcast. A synthetic voice drones on about FEMA Incident Management Assistance Teams mobilising and joint operating facilities being established in the state capital. You hear the words, "federal assets," and a wave of relief washes over you. You look at your exhausted family and tell them that help is finally on the way. The radio crackles, mentioning that adjacent jurisdictions are beginning to set up contamination screening camps. The horizon is still choked with a sickly yellow haze, but that tiny mechanical voice in the dark feels like a lifeline. You convince yourself that a convoy of white trucks with flashing amber lights is going to roll over the hill by nightfall. You imagine soldiers handing out bottled water and MREs, organising an orderly evacuation of your mid-sized town. That radio broadcast is the most dangerous thing in your house right now. It provides the illusion of impending rescue, which drains your operational urgency. You stop planning for tomorrow because you assume the government will handle tomorrow for you. You are listening to a phantom broadcast from a world that no longer cares about your zip code. The belief in an immediate federal rescue triggers a devastating behavioural collapse. People hear the word FEMA on the radio and they instantly cease all survival operations. I have seen footage of families dragging lawn chairs up to their second-story windows or even sitting on their roofs, staring at the sky, waiting for helicopters that are never going to come. They stop rationing their food. They hand out their last bottles of clean water to their kids, thinking they will just get more from the National Guard in a few hours. They completely drop their security posture. They leave their front doors unlocked so the rescue teams can find them easily. This passive waiting turns active survivors into helpless victims. They treat the disaster like a delayed flight at an airport. They just sit in the terminal, complaining about the wait time, completely oblivious to the fact that the airport is burning down around them. When the sun starts to set on day 3 and the helicopters have not arrived, the false hope instantly rots into severe panic. They burned their last calories waiting for a bailout, and now they have to face the cold, dark reality of a grid-down night with zero supplies and zero preparation. Passivity in a post-nuclear environment is a slow form of suicide. You might think the federal government has an unlimited logistical tail that can reach every corner of the country simultaneously. You might argue that paying taxes guarantees an immediate emergency response. Here is the steelman reality of federal disaster deployment. FEMA incident management assistance teams are highly capable, but they operate regionally. They require massive logistical footprints to establish joint operating facilities. They need secure airfields, heavy equipment, and a perimeter that can be defended. They are setting up those hubs in major metropolitan outskirts or untouched military bases hundreds of miles away. Your mid-sized town does not have the infrastructure to support a sudden influx of federal assets, especially when the roads are clogged with EMP-fried vehicles and the radiation levels are still sitting at 10 Roentgens per hour. The government triage protocol dictates that they secure the surviving power grid and critical supply chains first. Residential rescue in heavily contaminated secondary zones is at the absolute bottom of the priority list. Adjacent jurisdictions might be setting up camps, but they are going to physically barricade their county lines to prevent panicked, contaminated refugees from overwhelming their limited resources. They will turn you away at gunpoint if you try to cross the county line covered in fallout. Self-reliance is not a libertarian talking point in this scenario. It is the mandatory operative mode for survival. You are the highest-ranking official left in your immediate vicinity. The specific complication of the federal Mirage is what happens when your neighbours figure out the rescue trucks are not coming. For the first 48 hours, people stay relatively polite because they think civilization is just paused. By hour 72, the social contract completely disintegrates. The realisation that there is no external authority sparks a violent competition for whatever local resources are left. The guy across the street, who was waiting patiently for a FEMA ration truck, is now looking at your house, wondering if you have extra canned goods. The threat shifts rapidly from the invisible radiation in the sky to the very visible, desperate father holding a tire iron on your front porch. You are not locking your doors to secure your property. You are locking them so your child does not have to watch you engage in hand-to-hand combat over a half-empty box of granola bars. The guilt of turning away a starving neighbour is crushing, but you have to harden your mind. If you give up your supplies out of pity, you are just transferring their death sentence onto your own family. The delay in federal response creates a tactical vacuum, and desperate humans will violently fill that vacuum. You must establish a hard perimeter and enforce strict operational security before the neighbourhood realises that the cavalry is dead. The most terrifying sound on day 3 is not an explosion. It is the hollow, dry rattle of your kitchen faucet. You stand at the sink, turning the handle all the way to the left, expecting the familiar rush of municipal water. Instead, the pipes groan. A single, muddy drop falls into the stainless steel basin, followed by a wheezing gasp of compressed air. The municipal water system has officially bled out. For the first 2 days, you were living on the pressurised gravity feed left in the city water towers. Now, that reserve is bone dry. The bottled water you bought in the panic is disappearing fast. There is a cluster of empty plastic bottles sitting on the counter, mocking your lack of preparation. The EMP knocked out the massive electric pumps that push water from the treatment plant to your neighbourhood. Without grid power, the entire subterranean vascular system of the town is dead. You stare at the dry sink, feeling a tight knot form in your chest. The reality of the water crisis hits you like a physical blow. You can survive weeks without food, but without water, the human body begins to shut down its vital organs in a matter of days. The countdown clock just accelerated, and every time you swallow, your dry throat reminds you of the impending deadline. When the taps run completely dry, the standard civilian reaction is sheer panic, followed by catastrophic decision-making. They treat it like a bad camping trip. I have seen footage from disaster zones where people literally scoop water out of the upper tank of their toilets with a coffee mug, thinking it is perfectly safe because it looks relatively clear. They do not realise that the internal tank is a breeding ground for heavy metals eroding off the plumbing fixtures and bacteria accumulating in the stagnant water. Worse, they start frantically mixing random liquids. They drink soda, high-sugar juices, and even alcohol, completely ignoring the fact that diuretics accelerate dehydration. They fail to ration the few clean bottles they have left, chugging them blindly because they are stressed. They think hydration is a comfort measure rather than a critical biological resource. They act like heat and thirst are just inconveniences that will pass. This is what happens when people get their survival training from Hollywood. They react with blind desperation instead of operational discipline. They poison their own digestive tracts because they cannot pause for 10 seconds to assess the chemical reality of what they are ingesting. Drinking contaminated water in a grid-down scenario does not save your life. It just guarantees that you will die violently from dysentery instead of peacefully from dehydration. You might think the city water tower still has thousands of gallons of clean water sitting in it, and all you have to do is tap into the main line. You might argue that gravity does not need electricity to work. Here is the steelman reality of modern municipal engineering. Yes, gravity works, but the EMP fried the SCADA control systems that manage the entire network. When those computer systems go dark, municipal safety valves are designed to fail shut automatically to prevent a catastrophic loss of pressure or mass contamination. The water in that tower is locked behind massive steel valves that you cannot open without heavy machinery and authorization codes that no longer exist. Furthermore, without the electric pumps at the treatment plant constantly pushing fresh water through the mains, the remaining water in the pipes quickly stagnates and becomes a breeding ground for pathogens. You are entirely cut off from the grid. Filtration alone is not going to save you now. You cannot just screw a camping filter onto your garden hose and pray. You have to pivot immediately to securing alternative water sources, and that requires a fundamental understanding of hydrology and physics. If you do not accept that the municipal system is permanently dead, you will waste precious hours trying to hack a fire hydrant instead of building a sustainable water collection system in your own backyard. The specific complication here is not just that you are thirsty. Thirst is a standard biological mechanism. The real threat is the psychological collapse that happens when you realize you cannot provide for your dependents. You are not rationing water to keep your own heart beating. You need water so your child does not look at you with cracked, bleeding lips asking for a drink you do not have. Guilt is the heaviest weight in your rucksack right now. When you stare into the empty plastic of your last water bottle, you are staring at your own failure to prepare. The EMP took out the municipal pumps, but you are the one who failed to store enough reserves. Now you have to look your family in the eye and tell them their throats are going to burn for another day while you figure out a distillation plan. That immense guilt will tempt you to take dangerous shortcuts. It will tempt you to give them poorly filtered creek water just to stop their crying. Do not do it. You must compartmentalize that emotional pain. If you cave to the guilt and hand them chemically contaminated water, their temporary relief will be paid for with severe acute radiation sickness by the end of the week. You have to endure their tears to protect their lives. Desperation forces you out the back door and toward the local creek at the edge of your subdivision. You approach the tree line, staying low, keeping your improvised hazmat gear sealed tight against the wind. Through your fogged safety goggles, you finally spot the water. It is a slow-moving stream that used to be a scenic feature of the neighborhood. Now it looks like a toxic sludge pit. A fine layer of grey radioactive ash coats the surface of the water, swirling in oily patterns near the muddy banks. You see 2 dead fish floating belly up in the reeds, their silver scales coated in the same malignant dust. This is your alternative water source. It is heavily contaminated with both biological pathogens from broken sewer lines upstream and radioactive fallout from the sky. You kneel in the mud, holding a plastic bucket, staring at the glowing scum. Your throat is screaming for moisture, but your brain knows that taking a sip from this creek is playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded cylinder. You have to harvest this poison and somehow transform it back into life-sustaining hydration. The sheer volume of work required to process this water is staggering. You plunge the bucket into the creek, filling it with heavy, ash-choked water. You are essentially carrying a bucket of liquid death back to your kitchen. The most common civilian failure when dealing with surface water in a nuclear scenario is relying on primitive camping logic. People drag a bucket of radioactive river water back to their house, throw it on a propane camp stove, and crank up the heat. They think boiling it makes it perfectly safe. They act like boiling water is a magic wand that cures everything from cholera to nuclear fallout. Boiling water does absolutely nothing to strontium-90, cesium-137, or iodine-131. It just creates a highly concentrated pot of boiling radioactive water. Worse, as the water evaporates, it creates a cloud of radioactive steam that fills the kitchen. The survivor stands over the stove, breathing in vaporized isotopes, directly irradiating their lungs. This is what happens when people refuse to adapt their protocols to the specific threat profile. They react with blind desperation instead of scientific discipline. They assume that because boiling works during a standard municipal water boil advisory, it will work after a thermonuclear exchange. They poison their own families because they cannot differentiate between a biological threat and a radiological threat. You cannot burn away radiation with a camp stove. Every reckless attempt to rehydrate without proper distillation just introduces lethal isotopes directly into your gastrointestinal tract. You are basically committing slow suicide because you are too thirsty to think clearly. You might think you're outsmarting the problem because you have a high-end military-grade water filter in your bug-out bag. You might argue that your 0.2 micron ceramic filter is guaranteed to remove 99% of all contaminants. Here is the stillman reality that makes standard filtration useless in this specific scenario. Mechanical filters are exceptional at catching physical particulate matter. They will easily catch the large flakes of fallout ash, the dirt, and the Giardia parasites. But radioactive isotopes dissolve completely into the water at a molecular level. Dissolved strontium-90 acts exactly like dissolved salt. It passes right through the microscopic pores of your expensive ceramic filter without even slowing down. If you run fallout-contaminated water through a standard pump filter, the water that comes out the other end will look perfectly clear, and it will still give you a lethal internal dose of radiation. Filtration alone removes the physical particles, but leaves the dissolved isotopes entirely intact. You are dealing with a chemical solution, not just suspended dirt. The only proven method to separate dissolved radioactive isotopes from H2O is distillation. You have to boil the water to vapour, capture that pure steam, and condense it back into liquid form in a separate, clean container. The heavy radioactive elements are left behind in the boiling chamber. If you rely on a hollow fibre filter today, You will bleed internally tomorrow. The specific complication of distillation is what you are left with after the process is complete. When you successfully boil off the pure water and condense it, the original boiling pot does not just magically empty out. It becomes a concentrated reservoir of highly radioactive sludge. You have essentially created a miniature toxic waste dump in your own backyard or kitchen. The more water you distill, the hotter that boiling pot gets. You cannot just casually dump that sludge down the drain because it will irradiate your plumbing. You cannot dump it on your lawn, or you will create a localized hotspot right outside your window. You have to handle the waste product with the same extreme caution as a bomb disposal technician. You need thick gloves, a designated waste trench dug far away from your living quarters, and a strict protocol for transporting the sludge without spilling it on your boots. The psychological toll of constantly handling concentrated radiation just to get a sip of drinking water is immense. Every time you fire up the still, you are engaging in a hazardous materials operation. One spill, one cracked boiling vessel, and you contaminate the entire staging area. You are fighting a war against an enemy that lives inside the very resource you need to survive. There is zero margin for error. You are now forced to become an amateur chemical engineer under extreme duress. You stand in your backyard, scavenging materials to build a makeshift solar or fire-driven distiller. You rip a length of copper tubing out from behind your broken refrigerator. You find a large stainless steel pressure cooker in the pantry and a clean glass collection jug. You tape the copper tubing to the vent pipe of the pressure cooker, bending it carefully so it spirals downward into the glass jug. You pack the spiral coil with snow or cold dirt to ensure the steam condenses rapidly back into a liquid state. This is not a fun weekend DIY project. Your hands are shaking from dehydration, and the heavy nitrile gloves make the fine motor tasks agonizingly difficult. You light a small controlled fire under the pressure cooker, feeding it with chopped up furniture. You watch the heat build, praying that the duct tape seal holds against the rising pressure. The first drop of pure distilled water slowly forms at the end of the copper tube and falls into the glass jug with a hollow ping. It is the most beautiful sound you have heard in 3 days. But it is slow, agonizingly slow. It takes hours of constant monitoring, feeding the fire and maintaining the condensation coil just to produce a single litre of safe drinking water for your family. The civilian failure during makeshift distillation is a lack of rigorous quality control. People build these improvised rigs in a panic, and they do not pressure test the seals. They fire up the heat and completely ignore the small wisps of steam leaking from the junction between the pot and the copper tube. They think a little steam loss is just an acceptable inefficiency. They fail to realize that the escaping steam is highly pressurized and potentially carrying trace amounts of radioactive particulate that bypasses the condensation phase entirely. Worse, they use plastic tubing instead of copper or steel, completely oblivious to the fact that high-heat steam will melt the plastic, leaching toxic petrochemicals directly into their pristine drinking water. They go through the massive effort of removing nuclear fallout only to poison themselves with melted polyvinyl chloride. They get impatient and crank the fire too high, causing the contaminated sludge in the boiling pot to vigorously bubble and splash directly up into the condensation tube, ruining the entire batch. Distillation is a precise physical process. It requires patience and strict thermal regulation. If you treat it like a sloppy campfire cooking experiment, you will fail the chemistry test. And the penalty for failing this specific chemistry test is introducing radioactive heavy metals into your bloodstream. Building a functional distillation setup requires exact schematics and a solid understanding of fluid dynamics. You might think you can just look up the correct condensation coil length or the safe operating pressure on your phone. Here is the reality. When the grid goes down, your cloud notes are gone, your bookmarks are dead. The cell towers are completely offline. You cannot Google how to survive a nuclear winter while standing in the radioactive ash. You need a system that works entirely offline, right in your pocket. I built Protocol Survival to be that exact system. Secure your data now. The app stores all critical survival manuals, distillation schematics, and tactical checklists locally on your device. It functions as an offline database that does not require a cell signal to save your life. It is not a sponsor, it is your mandatory offline command center. When you are staring at a pile of copper tubing and a pressure cooker, wondering how to bend the coil without crimping it, Protocol Survival has the offline schematic ready. Stop relying on internet access that evaporates the second a crisis begins. Download the knowledge base directly to your hardware. If you do not have the schematics downloaded before the flash, you will be forced to guess the engineering principles, and guessing gets you killed when the stakes are this high. The specific complication of operating a makeshift still is that it acts as a massive beacon for anyone within smelling distance. You cannot run a fire-driven distiller without generating a smoke signature and the distinct smell of burning wood. While you are carefully monitoring the drip rate of your clean water, the rest of the neighbourhood is smelling your fire. They are waking up to the fact that someone on the block has a functional water processing operation. Your backyard suddenly becomes the most valuable piece of real estate in the zip code. You are no longer just an amateur chemist. You are the sole proprietor of the only clean water source around, and you have to defend it. You have to monitor the perimeter constantly while tending the fire. You have to position yourself so that you are not silhouetted by the flames. The threat is not just the radiation in the pot. It is the 3 desperate men creeping through the bushes behind your fence, carrying crowbars, intent on taking your pressure cooker by force. Operating a still forces you to divide your attention between complex chemical processing and acute tactical defense. If you focus entirely on the water, you will get ambushed. If you focus entirely on the perimeter, the still overheats and explodes. As the afternoon of day 3 wears on, you peer through the crack in your boarded-up living room window. The dynamic of the street has fundamentally shifted. For the first 2 days, everyone stayed inside, paralysed by shock and the initial fallout warnings. Now, the hunger and thirst are driving them out of their basements. You see shadows moving quickly between the ruined cars. You see a neighbour you have known for 10 years aggressively kicking in the front door of an abandoned house across the street, carrying a baseball bat. The illusion of a cohesive community has completely evaporated. The people outside are no longer your friendly neighbours who hosted block parties. They are competing apex predators operating under extreme physiological stress. You check the deadbolt on your door for the 4th time. You arrange heavy furniture against the entry points, creating a physical barricade. You instruct your family to stay away from the walls and keep their voices down to a whisper. The neighbourhood has transitioned from a disaster recovery zone into an active, hostile environment. Every sound outside is amplified. A breaking glass window sounds like a gunshot. A dog barking sounds like an alarm. You are watching the rapid, real-time devolution of civilized society from the front row seat of your living room. The standard civilian failure during this transitional phase falls into 2 equally lethal extremes. The first extreme is naive sharing. People hear a knock on the door and they open it to find a crying neighbour asking for food. The civilian, still operating under pre-collapse morality, hands over a box of crackers. They think they are being a good Samaritan. They do not realise they just signalled to the entire street that their house is fully stocked. That crying neighbour will tell 3 other people, and by nightfall the house will be overrun by a desperate mob. The second extreme is violent, paranoid hoarding. People sit on their porches with a shotgun, screaming at anyone who walks down the sidewalk, firing warning shots into the air. They think this projects strength. In reality, it completely destroys their operational security. Firing a weapon randomly alerts every hostile group within a 2-mile radius exactly where the guns and the supplies are located. Both reactions are driven by a lack of tactical discipline. The naive sharer gets looted through exploitation. The loud hoarder gets ambushed by a superior force drawn to the noise. In a grid-down scenario, you do not advertise your presence. You become a ghost. You do not engage unless the physical threshold of your home is violently breached. You might think that banding together with your immediate neighbours is the smartest tactical move. You might argue there is safety in numbers. Here is the Steelman reality of neighbourhood alliances on Day 3. Unvetted groups in a high-stress, low-resource environment inevitably lead to catastrophic resource drains and compromised operational security. You do not know how much water they have. You do not know if they broke decontamination protocols and are currently tracking radiation into your secure zone. You cannot afford to merge your disciplined logistics with their panicked chaos. True security requires force multipliers and the utilisation of fatal funnels. A fatal funnel is any narrow space, like a doorway or a hallway, that forces an intruder to enter single file, restricting their movement and making them an easy target. You do not confront trespassers out in the open on your front lawn. You lock the exterior down, kill the lights, and position yourself at a strategic angle inside the house, aiming directly at the fatal funnel. If someone breaches the door, they have to step into a choke point where you have the absolute tactical advantage. You maintain strict silence. You do not yell warnings through the door. You let the barricades do the work, and you only escalate to force if the fatal funnel is actively compromised. OPSEC means you do not exist until you absolutely have to. The specific complication of enforcing strict operational security is the severe psychological trauma of hearing the begging. It is one thing to mentally prepare to fight off an armed looter. It is entirely different when the person banging on your barricaded door is a mother from down the street, crying and pleading for asthma medication for her child. You can hear the desperation in her voice through the heavy wood of your door. Your instinct is to help. The guilt claws at your chest. You look at your own child sitting quietly in the dark, and you know you have a spare inhaler in your medical kit. But the rules of the grid-down environment are absolute. If you open that door, you break the perimeter seal. You risk radiation exposure. You risk a violent ambush if she is being used as bait by a larger group. You have to sit in the dark, gripping your weapon, and listen to her cry until she finally gives up and walks away. This is the true cost of survival. It is not just about filtering water and checking radiation dials. It is about bearing the immense emotional weight of the people you chose not to save. You are hardening your heart to ensure your family's heart keeps beating. The guilt never goes away. The sun finally drops below the horizon and the true horror of Day 3 descends on the town. When the grid was up, nighttime was just a shift in the lighting. Street lamps hummed, porch lights glowed, and the ambient light of the city bounced off the clouds. Now, the darkness is absolute. It is a suffocating, pitch-black void that swallows the entire neighbourhood. The temperature drops rapidly, chilling the stagnant air inside your house. You sit on the floor of your living room, peering out the window into a darkness so thick you cannot see the oak tree in your own front yard. The silence of the day is replaced by the terrifying sounds of the night. You hear the distant shatter of glass. You hear the low, guttural sound of an engine trying to turn over down the block. The darkness strips away the final illusion of safety. You are acutely aware that the walls of your house are just thin layers of wood and drywall separating your family from the chaos outside. Your physical exhaustion is overwhelming. You have been operating on adrenaline for 72 hours, and your body is demanding sleep. But the realization sets in that the long haul has just begun. There is no morning shift coming to relieve you. You are the only watchman left on the wall. The most catastrophic failure during the first true night of the crisis is violating light discipline. People get scared of the dark. They want comfort. So they strike a match and light a bright LED camping lantern, placing it right in the middle of their kitchen table. They think it makes the house feel normal again. They do not realize they just turned their home into a lighthouse in a sea of darkness. In a completely blacked out grid, a single bright window can be seen from miles away. Every desperate, freezing, thirsty person stumbling through the neighborhood will gravitate directly toward that light. It is a neon sign that screams, "We have supplies," and we are completely oblivious to security. I have seen houses targeted and breached simply because a family wanted to play board games by candlelight to calm their kids. They prioritized emotional comfort over tactical survival. They gave away their position because they were afraid of the dark. The intruders do not even need to scout the house. The light guides them straight to the back door. Breaking light discipline is the tactical equivalent of firing a flare gun into the sky and begging the worst elements of society to come and take everything you have. You might think a small shielded flashlight or a low-burning candle is safe if you stay away from the windows. You might argue that total darkness is impossible to navigate safely. Here is the steelman reality of blackout operations. Light leaks through cracks you do not even know exist. It bleeds under the door frame and slips through the edges of the blinds. Strict light discipline means boarding up the windows with thick contractor bags or heavy blankets long before the sun goes down. If you must use a light to check a medical issue, you use a red lens tactical flashlight under a heavy blanket, keeping the beam aimed at the floor. Thermal signatures are also a threat. A roaring fireplace not only emits light, but creates a massive heat signature and smoke trail that alerts everyone to your exact location. You endure the cold by layering clothes, not by building a fire. Furthermore, you cannot stay awake forever. You must implement a rigid sleep rotation. One adult is always awake, maintaining the watch at the fatal funnel, listening to the ambient noise of the street. The other adult sleeps. You rotate every 4 hours. If you try to stay awake all night out of paranoia, you will hallucinate by day 4 and make a fatal error. Discipline dictates the schedule. The morning of day 4 is rapidly approaching. You sit in the pitch-black silence of your hallway, feeling the weight of the rifle in your hands. The adrenaline has faded, leaving behind a cold, calculated clarity. You survived the flash. You survived the fallout assessment. You navigated the brutal mathematics of the water crisis, and you held the perimeter against the desperate collapse of your own neighbourhood. You look at the barricaded door and realise the profound shift in your reality. The government is not coming. The municipal pumps are never turning back on. The emergency radio is just a box of useless plastic. The darkness of day 3 is not just an absence of sunlight. It is the absolute realisation that the cavalry is dead. But that is fine. You are the cavalry now. Your family is breathing because of the brutal, unforgiving protocols you enforced. You stopped waiting for the old world to rescue you, and you built a fortress in the ashes of the new one. People think civilization is a permanent fixture. They think the power lines just power their televisions. They are wrong. The grid isn't what keeps the lights on. It's what keeps the monsters out.